Now that we are more familiar with the different ways on how we can apply some spacing in our element, let's just go and thoroughly understand what the box model is. So let me go and create another file here, boxmodel.html file, and create another template for HTML5, and then inside of that I would want to have, here first box multiply by 2, so at least we'll have 2 divs, and then we'll just replace this with a second box. We'll have a class name of second box, and here we'll be placing here first box element content, so that means that will be the content of our element. Second box element content, and after that let's just go and add a style tag here, and then inside of the style tag let's go select our class name first box, and then background color, let's have a blue color here, and here second box, and then let's have a background color of red. So you would see that IntelliSense is actually helping me out here in typing my code. And now I want to open this up in my File Explorer, and then we can see here now that we have here a first box element content and a second box element content that fills the box exactly based from the size, height, and width of the element content that we've created here. We can see here that there's a margin here from the elements that we have here, the div element, first content box, and the second element box here. We can see that there's a margin on top, on the right, and I'm sure there's also a margin at the bottom. So the default value for margin value for the body element is usually 8 pixels, as we can see here in our box model here. So what I want to do here is so that we can remove all of those paddings and margins in general for all of the elements. What we can do here is actually use the universal selector. So we call this the universal selector. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to place padding 0 and margin 0, and then perhaps let's specify a font size. You would see that the element content will increase the size of the font, and it will also be increasing the box that we have in our document, which is a rectangular box right now. So if I go and increase this to 60 pixels, let's see what will happen. So let's go check out our content here. You would see now that there's no more margin and padding no more margin on our first box element content here and the second box element content. So if we talk about the box model, one key thing to be aware of is that all HTML elements can be considered as boxes. For you to understand what the box model is, just remember that any elements or HTML elements is a box. That means that it can be in a rectangular shape here or a square type of box depending on the properties that we have set in our code. So we can see here that the element content that we have assigned here is filling up the content of the rectangular box here. So depending on the property that we set based from the different properties that we've tackled before, the padding, the margin, and the border, this will be giving space inside of our document here, inside of our element box here. So in this case, we maximize the use of 60 pixels. So if we try to change this, you would see that the size of our box will be changing depending on the element content's size. So let's go back to our document here and refresh this. You would see that the box has now shrinked based from the element content that we have here. This just means that the element content that we have here will be affecting the size of our box or the box for this specific div element. So if we want to go and add some space inside of the element, we can use the padding property. So let's try applying some padding inside of our first box element. So let me open our code here, code editor, and then add some padding property here. And let's see what will happen if we add some padding property of 20 pixels. So if I go back to our document and refresh this, you will now see that we have a padding on top, right, bottom, and left. And if we go to the developer tools, you would see that if we go and select the div element here and inspect it, it will show us that the box model here the box model inside of our div element will be having a padding of 20 pixels from the left, from the top, right, bottom, and left. So we were able to add some space, and we can see here that the element content is being selected once we hover on top of the middle part of the box model. And if we hover on top of the padding part here, where we can see the 20 pixels, our code editor here is giving us some tip here, and it's showing us the padding, the border, once we hover it on top of the element. Now, if we go back to our code in our code editor and try to apply some padding or border, as you remember, we can apply some width, we can apply some styling, and let's go use green. And if we go save this and we try to open our document again and then close this and open this up, now we have a solid green border. Let me increase the border here so at least it will be more visible. Let's have 4 pixels and then save it and then open our document here again. Let me just go to our document, and now we have a green border that adds space from the padding will be adding space between the border and the element content, and the border will be adding space from the corners of our document here, or the browser, which means will be the margin of the document itself. So we now understand the padding is the background. It will be increasing the background of the element based from the values that we have given it. And we can see that mostly in CSS, we use the padding so that we can increase the background of the element. So we can see here that we have the border of 40 pixels. Let's make it a lot bigger so at least it will be much bigger. And if we go and look at it, the border will be around the padding of an element. And if we go add another property, which is the margin, we know that it's currently 0, so we go and add some 20 pixels here, and you would see that our document now will have a white space outside of the border of the element. Key things to remember here will be that if we go and use padding, when we use padding, we are aiming to add some space. Padding is usually used for us to add space to the background of the element, and margin is usually used for us to add space between two elements. So in this case, we have the second box and the first box, and we were able to add some space. You can see here we have 20 pixels of space between the first box, the bottom part of the first box, and the upper part of the second box content. If we try to go and look at the developer tools that we have here, we can see that in the box model, we have a 1206 width for the element content by 47. And we can give distinct values to the height and width of the element content by declaring the height and width of the element. So let's say I would want to have a height of 100 pixels and a width of 600 pixels. So if I save that and we go back to our document here and open our developer tools here, you would see now that we have a specific 600 pixels for the width and 100 pixels for the height of the document. So the next thing that I want to show you here, guys, is that if we try to copy this and paste it here in our second box here, and I'm just going to remove this first, the margin, and let's see what will happen to our document. Now we have the same outline. We have border, we have padding in the second box element content here, and we have the same margin. So the question here, if you're asking, let me just put this on the side, dock to the right, and if you're asking why isn't the second box element not aligned here, because we haven't set any margin yet. So if I go to our document here and put a margin of the same margin, take note of the thing that we did here, we placed 40 pixels. So if we go back to our document and save this, you're asking, why isn't this pushing the second box element content downward? If we try to compute, this should be at least 80 pixels. So the distance between the two should be at least 80 pixels. But if we try to look at it here, the second box element only has 40 pixels from the margin top, and the first box element is also showing us 40 pixels, from wherein it should be at least 80 pixels if we combine the bottom margin here and the top margin of the second box element. This is because in the box model, the margin actually collapses between two elements that are near each other. And since these are two elements that share the same margin, it collapses itself. And usually, the one that has a larger margin will be the one that will be applied if we, for example, made this 80 pixels. Let's see what will happen. You would see that the value here, the one that got applied is the 80 pixels, but the second box here still has the 40 pixels as the margin. But if we go to the first box, you would see that it's collapsing the 40 pixels of the second box, and it's still consuming that space between the two elements. Now, if I try to go to our document here and change this to 0 pixels, you would see that the 80 pixels is still the one that will be applied. And you would see that our first element here is still occupying the margin of 80 pixels, not the one that was set here. And it doesn't have any zero margin anymore. It has a zero margin now based from our declaration. So just remember that the larger value that we applied will be the one that will be applied in our document. So if we change this margin to 100 pixels, the margin that will be applied in our document will be the 100 pixels that is set here in our second box element. Okay, so that's how the box model works with regards to declaration of values for the margin. And you would see that here the second element is the one that is being implemented for the margin between the two elements that shares the space. So we have the first box element and the second box element. Another topic that I just want to discuss here will be the height and width here. As you can see here, we have a 600 width by 100 width based from the declaration that we've made here inside of our first box and even in our second box here. But the issue here is that we can see that if we hover on the box model content, element content, it shows us a 680 by 180 height and width. So this is happening because by default, we add up the top and bottom border and padding to the element's height and width. So in this case, we have the height of 100 plus 20 padding top plus 20 border top width, and the bottom padding and the border bottom width, which will be equivalent to 180. And that's the same goes with the width. We have here 600 plus 20 plus 20, 640 plus 20 plus 20, 680. By default, the margin will not be adding to the height and the width of the element. If we want the height and width to be the actual width that we've declared for our element, what we can do here is to use the box sizing property. So box sizing and border box. So this will be making the height and width account for the padding in the border of our element. So if we try to go and save this, let's try to look at our document here and refresh it. You will now see that the content element has now decreased to 520 by 20. So that means 520 plus 20, that will be equivalent to 5, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 600. And here we have 20 plus 20, 40, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100. So we have a total of 600 by 100. So the content will now be technically inside of the actual height and width that we gave it, which is 600 by 100. I'm hoping that you got the idea here that now that if we try to hover on the content element here, the element content, we can see that it shrunk down to 520 by 20, so that the padding in the border will be accounted for and will be equivalent to 600 by 100, which is the declaration inside of our code here, which is the height and the width that we wanted for the first box that we've created. So let me just change the font size here, so at least we can 20 pixels. Let's see what will happen in our document. And if we try to refresh this, now it's inside of the box content as equivalent to the 600 by 100 height and width that we've declared. So the developer tools can really be very helpful, especially if you want to go and explore and understand the content of your box model here for the padding, the margin, and the border, for the different spacing properties that you can tweak and play around with, so that you can position and add some spacing between each of the elements that you have in your document. And another key thing that I just want to show you here is that the box sizing border box property here is actually a very useful tool, especially in making sure that you won't need to do the mathematical computation anymore when it comes to your elements. That's why we normally put it inside of the universal selector here, so that it will be applied, and anything that we've declared here in the height and width property will be the actual height and width that will be applied in our class declaration, or the declaration that we have done in the CSS for the height and width of the element that we want to apply styling with. So the border box sizing property here will be applied to all of the element once you place it inside of the universal selector. So we can see here, if we go and try to refresh our document, let me just go to our document here. You will see now that the box sizing property was also applied inside of our second box element. And if I go and change the universal property here and create a 20 pixel font size, the same one that I declared here, so I didn't declare it inside of the second box, but if I go and declare it inside of the universal selector, you would see that once we try to refresh, save this, and then refresh, and then refresh our browser here, we can see now that the element got the implementation of the code that we declared inside of the universal selector.